can see that there is a shift in that direction. Let's talk a little bit more about low E glass. So you can see here, a regular glass here, we're looking at the visible spectrum up here, and we're looking at infrared here, and specifically near infrared is in this red box. So here, regular glass, plenty of near infrared that gets transmitted through. Here we have high solar grade low E, a little bit less, moderate solar grade low E glass, a little bit less, and then very low solar gain low E glass. You can see almost no infrared radiation is allowed to pass through that glass. How can you tell whether or not your glass is low E or not low E? Stand in front of it when the sun is coming through it. If you feel warmth on the other side of that glass coming through, it's probably a regular glass. If you don't feel much warmth, then it's blocking that beneficial, I believe, near infrared radiation. So this is nighttime. This is what nighttime used to be many years ago. We used to gather around fires and we used to get this glow of a fire. Have you ever sat in front of a fire and felt that warmth? Maybe you went camping. You probably found that it was pretty easy to sleep that night unless you were worried about bears attacking you in your tent. But nevertheless, the fire is low down, it's reddish orange, and it's got a low intensity to it. Compare that to now. This is a visible picture of Times Square. All sorts of lights, bright lights, high up, and they're going throughout the entire night. And that's really the difference between then and before. Let's talk really briefly about nature again in modern society. So again, we're looking at near infrared photons. As soon as the sun starts to come up, because near infrared can penetrate through that atmosphere, it can go through a lot of things. You're getting the benefit of near infrared both at the beginning of the day and also at the end of the day. But because the sun has to be very high in the sky for ultraviolet to penetrate, as you can see here, most of that radiation is coming between the times of 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. And so if you want to avoid ultraviolet light, you can avoid those times. But think about what happens naturally. Here, at the beginning of the day, you're getting melatonin. Your body is filling up with melatonin. It's ready for the ultraviolet onslaught. And then the ultraviolet onslaught hits at around 10 o'clock. And then you get these free radicals that delay a little bit. And then finally, as that happens and it goes away, then again, you're getting that near infrared towards sunset to repair the damage that has already occurred. So the three phases would be preparation for ultraviolet, survival from ultraviolet, and then finally repair from ultraviolet. That's what happened when we spent time outside. In terms of modern societies, we're not getting any or very little near infrared radiation. We're spending a lot of our time inside. We're still getting those photons of light. Remember, I showed you that graph that showed oxidative stress. There was no wavelength that gave no problem. There was always a little bit, right? Most of it being in the ultraviolet area. And then, of course, free radicals are happening as a result of those UV and HEV photons, or those high energy photons. So this is not a good situation. And it's not surprising that if we live in this type of a situation and then we get a straw that breaks the camel's back in the form of COVID or SARS-CoV-2, that it can push us over the edge, especially in a society where we have a lot of diabetes and obesity. So Kyle, we've talked a lot about how humans interact with light. We talked about sleep, circadian rhythm, and mood. And now we've talked about the exciting aspects of near-infrared radiation coming from the sun that can cause us to make melatonin in our mitochondria and protect us from a lot of these diseases that are associated with mitochondria.
Okay, Dr. Schwald, I have some rapid-fire questions for you. And the first is about light bulbs. And you mentioned that the newer light bulbs, LED bulbs, for example, that many people, including me, have in my home, and they're great for energy efficiency. I don't know if we want to go back to the days of incandescent bulbs because they use so much more energy. So are there any LED bulbs that give off infrared light?
Well, actually, Kyle, there are. They are starting to produce LED bulbs that can produce in the infrared spectrum. Unclear exactly how beneficial that's going to be, but they are producing those, and I'm sure further tests are going to be done on those.
Do window screens or door screens block infrared light? In other words, can you open up a window and
ray of sun coming through and it's warm? You're probably getting enough. But remember that you can also get infrared radiation.
So speaking of light bulbs, what temperature bulb do you recommend people have in their homes?
So the type of temperature that you need during the waking hours would be something more in the blue spectrum. So, 4,000 or 5,000 K would be the type of bulb that we're talking about. So full spectrum daylight. Whereas the areas of your home that you go to sleep in, those are the types of lights in that area that you'd want to have a much warmer color. So something like 2,700 K or 3,000 K. And that's generally what we're talking about. But again, remember what we talked about is if you're getting ready to go to bed, you should have those things on dimmers. I think that's more important to dim those lights. And if possible, have the light coming from down below or on the wall low as opposed to overhead because of what we talked about with where those intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are. They're on the inferior portion of the retina. Therefore, they're going to be sensitive to light coming from above.
So for the morning light viewing, do I need to look directly at the sun or in the vicinity of the sun, or is it just enough to be outside as long as the sun's out or as long as I'm out during daylight hours, even on a cloudy day?
So generally, I wouldn't recommend looking directly at the sun, like staring at the sun, but looking in the general direction of the sun, I think, is probably the most efficient way of getting the most amount of lux in the shortest amount of time. I can think about a sunrise or a sunset. There, the light is not as intense, and generally you can look in the general direction of the sun. But for the most part, looking in the general direction is better than looking directly at the sun.
You mentioned trying to get that morning outdoor light viewing as close to your wake up time as possible. What if someone is busy in the morning or they forget to go outside and they go outside at 10 o'clock? Is it still beneficial? Is it less beneficial than if you did it right after waking up?
So from an infrared aspect, it's plenty fine to get good sunshine exposure going outside at 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. You're getting good infrared light and exposure. But from a circadian rhythm standpoint, you're really the benefit of getting early light exposure in terms of anchoring your circadian rhythm and getting that in place. The best benefit is going to be early in the morning. As you go later and later, the effect of that sun exposure is not going to be as much.
We briefly discussed this earlier, but there's this optimal way that our circadian rhythm can be interacting with our environment. And then there's reality. Some people need to work at night. Some people need to work on their screens late for various reasons. If people are going to be using screens after the sun has set, besides a screen program that makes the light more red or using blue blockers, are there any other strategies that one can use if they must interact with screens?
So the two pieces of advice that I would say at that point is, in addition to what you've just said, is number one, try to make sure that it's lower in your visual field, and we've talked about why that is. But then secondly, remember that the intensity of the light is what it is that's going to inhibit melatonin from being secreted. And so intensity, in terms of the equation for intensity, is the inverse of the distance squared. So what I mean by that is, if you double the distance, the intensity goes down fourfold. If you triple the distance, then the intensity goes down ninefold. So holding things further away from your face and holding it down low might improve or diminish the effects of light on melatonin secretion.
So if I wake up in the middle of the night, I need to check my phone for some reason, I should probably hold that phone as far away from my eyes as possible, dim the screen as much as possible, and also hold it below the level of my eyes. Is that right?
Yes, and I find myself doing that more and more because just my vision, I'm a little bit more farsighted now, and so I'm almost doing that as a reflex, but that's exactly what I would recommend.
For people who can't go outside or they're working too much and they're not really able to go outside, can they just take a melatonin supplement?
No, so a melatonin supplement is only going to put melatonin into your bloodstream, and that really only should be happening before you go to bed. If you want melatonin where it needs to be, which is in the mitochondria, so that it's absorbing the oxidative stress, you really need to go out into the sun, or at least go outside so you can get the reflective near-infrared spectrum. There are other ways potentially of doing that with infrared saunas, infrared lamps, and there's a number of research articles that are coming out about the benefits of near-infrared saunas. But again, if you want to make this simple, going outside is really going to help a lot of things. And sometimes the best way to get better is not just to take a pill or a supplement. Sometimes you actually just have to go outside and get nature's benefits.
I want to ask you about different latitudes. So matching your circadian rhythm to what's going on in reality, as you put it, seems relatively doable if you live right on the equator or close to the equator, where the average day length is pretty much the same. But what about people living up in Alaska or Canada or extremely southern latitudes, where, as we know, in the summer, they're going to have very long days, maybe only a few hours of true darkness, and the opposite in the winter, basically dark most of the day, most of the 24 hours, and just a few hours of light. What should they do to, anchor their circadian rhythm and have optimal health?
Well, they're going to have to change their environment around them when they're inside. So the same technologies that have allowed human beings to live at those extreme latitudes in Alaska and maybe way down there in South America and maybe in the Antarctic is the same technology that's going to allow them to live well in those areas. So let's just take the summertime. If it's bright very early in the morning, make sure that you've got windows and doors in your bedroom that are sealed off so you can control when the light comes in and when the light doesn't come in. And then at night, if the light, again, is coming in late in the evening and you want to go to bed, you want to make sure that you've got your circadian rhythm, make sure that you're able to block off that light. And I would say the same thing as well in the wintertime. So if the sun doesn't come up until very late, that's going to be a problem. So investing in a light box that will allow your circadian rhythm to be entrained. And then obviously we have no problem with technology in terms of keeping the lights on in a house until a reasonable hour. So we're going to have to use a little bit of technology because we're living in places that we're not normally used to living in.
Dr. Schwalb, given all this great information that you've shared, can you summarize it and also distill it down into some tips that we can implement right away?
So here are those 3 tips that we promised you. Number 1, get as much natural sunlight, whether it's direct or indirect, and it doesn't really matter in this case. Get as much as you can, avoiding glass in between, within reason, and get it as soon as you wake up in the morning. That's step number 1. Tip number 2, exposure to low-level red light, fire, or sunset at sunset time is advisable because you get that near-infrared radiation, and it kind of tells you when it is that you're shutting down in terms of your circadian rhythm. That's number 2. Number 3 is to avoid any type of light exposure after sunset, especially blue light, and we've talked about why that is, and especially in the 1 to 2 hour time period before you go to bedtime. We've already gone over why these are the case. We've talked about the circadian rhythm, we've talked about the mood aspect to light exposure, and we've talked about the antioxidant effect of near-infrared radiation. And Kyle, I have to tell you that as a critical care specialist, especially seeing that data in the Netherlands and in England, where over the previous 7-day period of time, that had changes in the metabolic activity of the body, I have to wonder whether or not in COVID-19 patients, whether we should be advising that they go outside, that they get into the sun, or at least have indirect sun exposure. And I'm looking at those photographs of those hospitals back 100 years ago and wondering whether...
Yes, Schwelt. I've written to you many times about this, especially after April of 2020, begging you to rail against the whole lockdown, go inside. That was, when I heard that, I just thought, holy cow, we're actively like stealing people's health. But well, not we. But yeah, and you've known this. You're one of the most intelligent physicians I've ever listened to. So I'm a little angry at your complacency at times.
Our COVID-19 patients might benefit from some time in the sun as well.
Well, Dr. Swell, thank you again for sharing your knowledge and answering questions. And for those of you watching that have questions, please leave those in the comment section below. We love looking over those, and hopefully we'll be able to address those in a future video. And if you enjoy